On October 31st, 1988, 17-year-old Amy Garrett left her family's farmhouse on the outskirts of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, wearing a hand-painted porcelain mask she'd borrowed from the town's historical society. She was heading to a Halloween bonfire at Cranesfield, less than 2 miles down Route 44. Her parents watched her walk toward the road, her flashlight beam cutting through the early autumn fog. She never arrived at the bonfire, and she was never seen again. For 34 years, the disappearance of Amy Garrett remained one of rural Pennsylvania's most haunting cold cases. Search parties combed the surrounding woodlands. Investigators questioned everyone in town, but no trace of Amy was ever found. No clothing, no belongings, no witnesses who saw her after she left that gravel driveway. The only thing missing, besides Amy herself, was that antique mask. Then, in September 2022, a renovation crew working on the old Holloway estate, a Victorian mansion that had been abandoned since the 1970s, made a discovery that would reopen the case and send tremors through the entire community. Behind a false wall in the third-floor attic, sealed behind plaster and horsehair insulation that hadn't been disturbed in decades, they found a small collection of items carefully arranged on a wooden shelf. Among them was a porcelain mask, hand-painted with delicate roses and gold filigree, the same mask Amy Garrett had been wearing the night she vanished. The problem? The attic had been sealed in 1952, 36 years before Amy disappeared. If this already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because what we're about to uncover gets stranger with every detail. To understand what happened to Amy Garrett, you first need to understand Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a town that time seemed determined to forget. Nestled in the Allegheny foothills, Millbrook was founded in 1843 as a mill town along Blackwater Creek. By the late 1800s, it had grown into a modest but prosperous community of about 800 residents, sustained by timber, grain mills, and a small textile factory. The town's crown jewel was the Holloway estate, built in 1889 by industrialist Edmund Holloway, whose lumber operations had made him one of the wealthiest men in the county. The Holloway mansion was a testament to Victorian excess: 3 stories of ornate gingerbread trim, wraparound porches, and a distinctive octagonal tower that overlooked the entire valley. Edmund Holloway had spared no expense, importing marble from Italy, stained glass from Germany, and hiring craftsmen from Philadelphia to create the elaborate woodwork that adorned every room. The estate became the social center of Millbrook's elite, hosting galas, charity events, and annual Halloween masquerades that drew guests from as far as Pittsburgh. But the Holloway fortune didn't last. Edmund's son, Thomas Holloway, proved to be a far less capable businessman. By the 1920s, the lumber operations had collapsed, and the family wealth had evaporated through a series of disastrous investments. Thomas became increasingly reclusive, retreating into the mansion with his wife, Margaret, and their daughter, Charlotte. The family's decline accelerated through the Great Depression. By 1940, Thomas Holloway was dead. Some said from drink. Others whispered about darker causes, and Margaret had become a ghost in her own home, rarely seen in town. Their daughter, Charlotte, born in 1918, had grown into a strange, solitary young woman who locals remembered as unsettling. She would appear in town occasionally, always dressed in outdated Victorian clothing, speaking in a formal, antiquated manner that made people uncomfortable. Then, in October 1952, Margaret Holloway died. Charlotte arranged a quiet funeral, attended by fewer than a dozen people. 2 weeks later, Charlotte herself was gone, not dead, but vanished. She simply left town one morning, taking nothing but a single suitcase. She left no forwarding address, no explanation, no contact information. The mansion was locked up tight, property taxes paid through a trust, and that was that. For the next 70 years, the Holloway estate stood empty, a slowly decaying monument to Millbrook's forgotten past. The Historical Society maintained the property taxes through a preservation fund, hoping that someday the house might be restored as a museum, but as decades passed, the mansion fell deeper into disrepair. By the 1980s, it had become what every small town needs, a haunted house that teenagers dared each other to approach on Halloween night. Which brings us back to Amy Garrett and the mask she borrowed on October 30th, 1988. Amy Garrett was, by all accounts, a bright and curious 17-year-old with a particular fascination for local history. She was a senior at Millbrook High School, where she maintained a 3.8 GPA and served as president of the History Club, a group that mostly consisted of Amy and 2 other students who met once a month to discuss genealogy projects and visit local cemeteries. Amy's interest in history wasn't casual. She spent hours in the Millbrook Public Library, poring over old newspapers on microfiche, studying property records, and documenting the town's past in a series of carefully maintained journals. Her bedroom walls were covered with photocopied photographs from the 1800s and hand-drawn family trees tracing the lineages of Millbrook's founding families. Her particular obsession, in the fall of 1988, was the Holloway family. Amy's grandmother, Ruth Garrett, had worked as a maid at the Holloway estate in the 1940s during the family's final years of occupancy. Ruth rarely spoke about her time there, but Amy had extracted a few stories over the years. Ruth described Margaret Holloway as a sad, nervous woman who spent most of her time in the third-floor rooms. She described Charlotte as peculiar, a young woman who seemed to exist in a different era, who collected strange objects and kept the third floor locked to everyone, even the household staff. In October 1988, Amy approached Dorothy Fletcher, the elderly director of the Millbrook Historical Society, with a request. The society had acquired several artifacts from the Holloway estate over the years, items that had been removed before the house was sealed in 1952. Among these was a collection of Victorian masquerade masks that had been used at the Holloway's famous Halloween galas. Amy wanted to borrow one of the masks for Halloween. Not to wear to parties, she explained, but as part of a history project she was working on. She wanted to photograph herself in period costume to create a series of then and now images comparing 1888 and 1988, the 100th anniversary of the mansion's construction. Dorothy Fletcher was initially hesitant. The masks were delicate antiques, and lending them out violated standard preservation protocols. But Amy was persistent and responsible, and Dorothy had known the Garrett family for decades. She agreed, with the stipulation that Amy would return the mask no later than November the 2nd. The mask Amy selected was particularly beautiful, a full-face porcelain design, hand-painted with climbing roses and gold accents. According to the Society's records, it had belonged to Charlotte Holloway herself and had been worn at the 1938 Halloween Masquerade, the last such event the Holloways ever hosted. Amy signed it out on October 30th, promising to take excellent care of it. She was excited, Dorothy later recalled, more animated than usual, talking rapidly about her research project and how she discovered some interesting connections in the Holloway family papers. When pressed about what those connections were, Amy had been vague. Things about Charlotte, she said, about where she went and why. I think I'm close to figuring it out. Those were the last words Dorothy Fletcher ever heard Amy Garrett speak. The evening of October 31st, 1988, started like any typical Halloween in Millbrook. The weather was unseasonably warm, with fog rolling in from Blackwater Creek as the sun set. Amy had spent the day at home, helping her mother prepare candy for trick-or-treaters and putting the final touches on her costume, a Victorian-era dress she'd sewn herself, complete with a cameo brooch and lace gloves. At 7:15 p.m., according to her parents' testimony, Amy finished getting ready. She carefully packed her camera, the porcelain mask, and a small notebook into her shoulder bag. She told her parents she was walking to Cranes Field for the annual bonfire, a tradition where Millbrook teenagers gathered every Halloween to roast marshmallows, tell ghost stories, and generally engage in harmless, small-town mischief. Her father, David Garrett, asked if she wanted a ride. Amy declined. It was a pleasant evening, and the walk was short. Her mother, Linda, reminded her to be home by 11 p.m. Amy kissed them both goodbye, switched on her flashlight, and headed down the gravel driveway toward Route 44. The Garrett farm was located about half a mile outside Millbrook proper, separated from town by a stretch of rural highway bordered by woods on both sides. The walk to Crane's Field should have taken Amy about 25 minutes. She would have reached the main road within 5 minutes, then followed Route 44 east for about a mile and a half before turning onto the dirt access road that led to the field. She never made it. The bonfire that night was attended by roughly 30 teenagers, including most of Amy's classmates. When she hadn't arrived by 8:30, her best friend, Jennifer Mason, tried calling the Garrett house. No answer. David and Linda had taken their younger son trick-or-treating in town. Jennifer figured Amy had been delayed or changed her mind, but when the bonfire broke up around 10 p.m. and Amy still hadn't appeared or called, Jennifer started to worry. She drove to the Garrett farm, arriving around 10:30 to find David and Linda just getting home. They were confused. Amy should have been at the bonfire hours ago. David immediately drove the route Amy would have walked, searching both sides of Route 44 with his high beams. Nothing. No sign of Amy. No indication she'd ever walked that road. At 11:15 p.m., he called the Pennsylvania State Police. By midnight, a full search was underway. State troopers, local police, and volunteers spread out along Route 44 and into the surrounding woods. They searched through the night and into the next day, expanding the search radius to cover a 5-mile area around the Garrett farm. They found nothing. No footprints, no dropped items, no disturbance in the roadside brush. Amy Garrett had simply vanished between her driveway and the main road, a distance of less than 1,000 feet. The investigation that followed was thorough, but ultimately fruitless. Investigators interviewed everyone who had been at the bonfire, everyone who lived along Route 44, everyone who might have driven that stretch of road on Halloween night. They brought in search dogs, which tracked Amy's scent from the farmhouse to the end of the driveway, then lost it completely, as if she had simply evaporated. The Pennsylvania State Police explored every possibility. Had she run away? Amy's diary, bedroom, and bank account suggested otherwise. Nothing was missing except what she'd carried that night. Had she met with foul play? There were no suspects, no witnesses, no evidence of a crime. The few cars that had been on Route 44 that evening were accounted for, their drivers cleared. As weeks turned to months, the investigation stalled. The Garretts appeared on local news, pleading for information. The case was featured in regional missing persons bulletins. But leads dried up, and eventually, reluctantly, the active investigation was suspended. Amy Garrett joined the ranks of the disappeared, those people who step into the fog and never return, leaving only questions and grief in their wake. For 34 years, Millbrook lived with the ghost of Amy Garrett. Her case became local legend, the girl who vanished on Halloween, the unsolved mystery that every true crime enthusiast in Pennsylvania knew about. The Garretts never moved, never stopped hoping, even as the years stretched into decades. David Garrett died in 2015. Linda was still living on the farm in 2022 when the phone call came. The renovation of the Holloway estate had begun in June 2022, funded by a historic preservation grant and a development group that planned to convert the mansion into a boutique hotel. The project manager was a local contractor named Michael Torres, who had grown up in Millbrook. Hearing stories about the haunted Holloway house, the mansion had deteriorated significantly over 70 years of abandonment. The roof had partially collapsed, water damage was extensive, and the interior was a maze of rotted floorboards and crumbling plaster. But the bones of the structure were solid, and the architectural details, the carved woodwork, the stained glass, the marble fireplaces, were worth saving. The third floor was in the worst condition. The octagonal tower room had been exposed to the elements for years, and the surrounding rooms were structurally questionable. On September 14, 2022, Torres and his crew were assessing the damage when they noticed something odd about the attic access. The attic entrance was a narrow door at the end of the third floor hallway. but when they opened it and climbed the stairs, the space they found didn't match the mansion's exterior dimensions. The attic seemed smaller than it should be, about 15 feet shorter than the building's actual length. Torres suspected a false wall, a common feature in Victorian architecture where servants' quarters or storage spaces were sealed off. Using a thermal imaging camera, they confirmed a void behind the northern wall. When they carefully removed the plaster, they found a concealed room, approximately 12 feet by 15 feet, that had been completely sealed with no visible entrance from inside the attic space. The air that escaped when they breached the wall was stale and dry, untouched for decades. Inside, preserved by the sealed environment, was a time capsule from 1952. The room appeared to have been Charlotte Holloway's private space, a combination study, workroom, and archive. There was a small writing desk, a bookshelf filled with leather journals, and several wooden crates containing what appeared to be personal effects and documents. The walls were covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn diagrams that Torres couldn't immediately decipher. But what caught everyone's attention was a wooden shelf mounted on the eastern wall. On it sat a carefully arranged collection of objects: a silver pocket watch, a child's leather shoe, a glass bottle containing dried flowers, a small bundle of letters tied with ribbon, and a porcelain mask, hand-painted with climbing roses and gold filigree. Torres photographed everything before touching anything. Something about the sealed room, the preserved objects, felt significant. He called the Historical Society and Dorothy Fletcher, now 93 years old but still sharp, came to the site within the hour. The moment she saw the mask, she knew. Even from across the room, even after 3 decades, she recognized it. She'd handled that mask dozens of times while cataloging the Historical Society's collection. She remembered Amy Garrett signing it out on October 30th, 1988. Dorothy's hands were shaking when she called the Pennsylvania State Police. The investigation that followed the discovery was unlike anything Millbrook had ever seen. The Pennsylvania State Police reopened the Amy Garrett case and launched a full forensic examination of the sealed room. The FBI's evidence response team was brought in to process the scene. Every object, every document, every photograph was cataloged and analyzed. The findings were deeply troubling, not because they revealed what happened to Amy Garrett, but because they made the mystery infinitely stranger. First, the forensic timeline. The room had been sealed, conclusively according to multiple independent analyses, in 1952. The plaster used to close the wall contained materials consistent with construction practices from that era and showed 70 years of undisturbed aging. The air inside the room had oxidized at a rate consistent with being sealed for 7 decades. There was no modern entrance, no way to access the space without demolishing the wall from the outside, and yet, inside this room that had been sealed 36 years before Amy disappeared, was the mask she had been wearing the night she vanished. The forensic analysis of the mask itself deepened the paradox. It matched the Historical Society's records perfectly. Same dimensions, same paint composition, same minor chips and imperfections that Dorothy Fletcher had documented in the Society's catalog. But it also showed evidence of having been exposed to outdoor conditions, pollen traces, mineral deposits consistent with Millbrook's local water, and microscopic organic matter that could only have come from the woods around Route 44. The other objects on the shelf were equally puzzling. The silver pocket watch bore the initials E.H. Edmund Holloway, the mansion's original owner. It had stopped at 1147, though the date was impossible to determine. The child's shoe was from the 1920s, belonging to a style manufactured between 1923 and 1928. The dried flowers in the glass bottle were identified as Queen Anne's lace, a common wildflower that bloomed along Route 44 every autumn. The letters were perhaps the most disturbing discovery. There were 7 of them, written in elegant copperplate handwriting on stationery bearing the Holloway family crest. They weren't addressed to anyone, and they weren't signed, but The content made clear they were written by Charlotte Holloway. They were confessions. In carefully composed prose, Charlotte described a practice she called preservation, a way of collecting moments, of keeping things from being lost to time. She wrote about her belief that certain objects, certain places, held the capacity to fold time back upon itself, to create spaces where past and present could overlap. She described the third-floor room as her cabinet of continuity, where she kept items that existed, somehow, outside of linear time. The letters included specific references. She mentioned the pocket watch, her grandfather's, which had stopped the moment he died in 1912. She mentioned the shoe, belonging to a child who had gone missing from Millbrook in 1927, whose disappearance had never been solved. She mentioned other objects, other collections, other moments preserved, and in the final letter, dated October 1952, Charlotte wrote about leaving Millbrook. She described feeling the weight of what she had been collecting, the responsibility of maintaining these overlapping moments. She wrote that she was sealing the room so that time might settle, so that what has been folded might lie flat. The last line was chilling. I have kept what should not be kept. Perhaps sealing them away will let them rest. Or perhaps I have only ensured they will surface when the moment circles back around. The journals found in the room offered more context, but no clarity. Charlotte had been studying temporal theory, metaphysics, and local folklore for years. She had documented dozens of disappearances and strange occurrences in Millbrook's history, tracing patterns she believed indicated thin places, locations where the barrier between times was permeable. One location appeared repeatedly in her notes, the stretch of Route 44 between the Garrett farm and Crane's Field. Charlotte had marked it as the fold, a place where, under certain conditions, the boundary between decades could blur. The investigation into the sealed room ultimately closed without conclusions that satisfied anyone. The official determination was that the mask's presence remained unexplained by conventional analysis. The FBI acknowledged the forensic paradox, but offered no theory that reconciled the timeline. The case was reclassified from missing person to unresolved death, though no remains had been found. Linda Garrett, now 78, was allowed to view the room before it was dismantled for evidence processing. She stood in that sealed space for nearly an hour, holding the mask her daughter had borrowed on Halloween 1988. When she finally spoke, it was to ask a question no one could answer. Where is she? Because that remained the terrible heart of the mystery. The mask had been found, but Amy Garrett had not. The room held objects that shouldn't exist together, but it held no explanation of how they came to be there, or what happened to the people they belonged to. The Historical Society took custody of Charlotte Holloway's journals and letters, which are now available to researchers by appointment. The renovated Holloway estate opened as a hotel in late 2023, though the third-floor attic room, now rebuilt, serves as a small museum dedicated to the building's history and the enduring mysteries associated with it. The most popular exhibit is a photograph, Amy Garrett's senior portrait from 1988, displayed beside a group photo from the Holloway Mansion's 1938 Halloween masquerade. In that older photograph, taken 50 years earlier, Charlotte Holloway stands at the edge of the frame wearing a porcelain mask painted with roses and gold. The same mask Amy borrowed 50 years later, the same mask found in a room sealed between those two moments in time. Visitors to the museum often ask the staff what happened to Amy Garrett. The honest answer is that no one knows, not in any way that makes rational sense. But sometimes, late in October, when the fog rolls in from Blackwater Creek and the evening takes on that particular quality of autumn light, the people of Millbrook will tell you that time isn't as linear as we'd like to believe. They'll tell you there are places, thin places, where decades fold back on themselves, where moments, separated by years, can touch. And they'll tell you that some disappearances aren't endings, but rather evidence that we don't understand the shape of time as well as we think we do. Amy Garrett walked down her driveway on Halloween night, 1988. Somewhere between her home and the road, she stepped into a fold that shouldn't exist. And somewhere, in a moment that might be past, or might be future, or might be folded so tightly that it's somehow both, she might still be walking, forever moving through that autumn fog, forever 17, forever carrying a camera and a Victorian mask and questions about the Holloway family that she was so close to answering. The mask was found. The girl was not. And perhaps that's the real horror. Not that the impossible happened, but that it happened incompletely, leaving us with proof of something we can't explain and a loss we can never reconcile. Some doors, once opened, can never be properly closed. Some mysteries are only deepened by the discovery of evidence. In Millbrook, Pennsylvania, they've learned to live with both. Sometimes the things we find don't answer our questions. They only prove that our questions were never quite right to begin with.